A plane mid-flight, a single slap, a uniformed soldier, and a decision that would ground an entire aircraft and ignite a national firestorm. He wore the uniform with honor. Jalen Cross, a young Army soldier returning home after 9 months overseas. In his backpack, letters for his little sister, written under desert skies. In his heart, the quiet hope of reunion. She wore a smile stretched thin by life's pressures. Morgan Wells, a flight attendant carrying more than just a tray of drinks. A sick mother, mounting debt, a job hanging by a thread, and a storm of fear hiding behind every "may I help you." They were strangers until one moment in the aisle changed everything. What looked like a simple misunderstanding, a soldier handing back a water bottle during turbulence, was mistaken as a threat. And in front of a cabin full of stunned passengers, Morgan raised her hand and slapped him. The plane never made it to its destination. Instead, it became the stage for public outrage, viral headlines, and a legal and moral showdown between judgment and justice. But here's the truth. This is not just a story about a slap. This is a story about what happens after. How do you respond when your dignity is stripped at 30,000 feet and cameras are rolling? Can remorse ever truly rewrite the damage of a single impulsive act? What does accountability really look like, and who decides when redemption is enough? As media stormed the gates and hashtags took over the internet, 2 lives unraveled in opposite directions, one into unexpected heroism, the other into devastating consequences. And yet, through all the pain, fear, and confrontation, something else began to emerge, a fragile thread of understanding. So we ask you, would you forgive someone who humiliated you in front of the world? Would you admit fault when the world demands your head? And when fear and stress push people to the edge, is there still room for compassion? This isn't just about race, uniforms, or viral justice. It's about what it means to be human in the moments that matter most. You think you know what happened on that flight, but the real story, the one that wasn't captured on camera, is just beginning. Like this video, if you believe stories like this need to be heard, share it to spark the conversations that matter. Subscribe to our channel for the full series and find out how a slap became a symbol and what came after. Now, let's begin. A slap echoed through the air, tearing apart the fragile silence like a bolt of lightning in the night. No one on Flight 274 from Eastport International Airport to Sierra Bay could have predicted that amidst the slight turbulence, an incident would erupt right in row 17, turning it into the epicenter of a national storm. A slap, decisive, sharp, and resounding, landed squarely on the cheek of a young black soldier dressed in full uniform. That was Jalen Cross, a private first class in the United States Army, just returning home from an intense 9-month deployment overseas. He had done nothing wrong. Throughout the journey, he behaved properly and courteously. But in an instant, all eyes turned toward him as if he had triggered the earthquake himself. The commotion didn't stop in the passenger cabin. It spread to social media, television, and the enraged hearts of millions. But it all began on a chilly autumn morning at Eastport International Airport, when passengers from all walks of life gathered, some on business, others eagerly awaiting a vacation, all unaware of what was about to unfold. In seat 17C, Jalen Cross sat upright, his backpack neatly tucked under his feet, clutching a small journal where he had written letters to his 12-year-old sister, Zuri Cross. For the past year, he could only send messages through encrypted emails from his base. Today was the first time he would return home, the first time he could sit again in his usual spot at the dinner table, which their mother had left empty for months. Meanwhile, at the boarding gate, Morgan Wells, the lead flight attendant of AeroVantage Airlines, was smiling as she greeted each passenger. Tall, with neatly tied hair and a crisp uniform, she looked every bit the professional. But behind those gentle eyes raged a storm. Her mother was hospitalized with end-stage kidney failure, and her credit card debt had long crossed the red line. Persistent headaches throbbed like the knock of a crisis she could no longer keep at bay. Still, Morgan wore her professional mask, determined to complete the flight without letting anyone suspect a thing. As the plane rolled onto the runway, she and her colleagues began the in-flight safety demonstration. Jalen, as always, listened attentively. He maintained the same seriousness he had in military training, even though most of the passengers around him were busy plugging in headphones or scrolling through their phones. That was what made Morgan notice him. She gave a slight nod in thanks, a reflex of her profession, but with a hint of sincerity. Jalen responded with a tired yet warm smile. A rare moment of peace before everything unraveled. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers settled into flight mode, some watching movies, others dozing off. Jalen reclined slightly, pulled the journal from his backpack, and began writing to Zuri about the funny stories from the base, the stubborn camels, and his card-playing comrades who stayed up late into the night. Next to him, an elderly couple whispered about their destination. The atmosphere was briefly calm. Meanwhile, Morgan and her co-worker Irene Salas began the beverage service. The metal cart clattered down the narrow aisle, wobbling from the light turbulence. Morgan struggled to maintain her smile as she asked each person what they'd like to drink. But beneath it all, the storm of stress continued to swell. She lost patience when she noticed Irene was moving slower than usual. At one point, she snapped in a low voice, "We need to hurry. The whole back cabin is still waiting." Irene furrowed her brow, but said nothing, silently continuing her task. The tension between them had already begun to crack the surface. When they reached Jalen's row, Morgan gave another slight nod this time, her eyes heavy with something unnamed. "Would you like something to drink?" Her voice still professional, but with a slight tremble. "Ginger ale, if you have it," Jalen replied softly. As she handed him the drink, their eyes met once more. He sensed something deeply wrong in the way she looked at him, as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, and even the gentlest breeze could send her over. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but didn't. Too much had already happened today. Morgan Wells handed the ginger ale to Jalen Cross, and he gave a gentle nod in thanks. She turned away without replying, letting out a quiet sigh before pushing the service cart forward. Just as she turned, a passenger seated behind Jalen suddenly reached into the cart, rummaging through the cans as if it were a self-serve station. "Sir, please let me serve you. You can't just—" Morgan's voice snapped, pitched sharper than necessary. The man frowned, shooting her an irritated glance. From that moment, the tension began to spread like an oil slick in the narrow cabin. A baby's piercing cry, murmurs of complaints, frustrated glances, all of it blended into a soundtrack of a flight teetering on the edge of control. An hour later, the AeroVantage Airlines plane entered a new zone of turbulence. The seatbelt sign lit up once again. Passengers fumbled with their belts while the flight attendants tried to wrap up their unfinished tasks. Morgan, with only half her service route completed, stopped near Jalen's row. Behind him, a mother tried to soothe a crying, red-faced infant. Across the aisle, another passenger shouted for an extra blanket. She scanned the scene and stopped at Jalen, who was quietly observing. His eyes weren't judgmental, only calm and full of empathy. He understood what it meant to be caught in the whirlwind of duty and emotion. He'd been there amid gunfire and the cries of fellow soldiers. He almost spoke up to comfort her, but hesitated. He knew that even the kindest words at that moment could be the drop that spilled the cup. No one knew that the cup was already at the brim, and Jalen was about to be the one it spilled on. The flight, a cramped metal tube slicing through the clouds, was a gathering place of all human emotions: anxiety, fatigue, hope, fear. For Morgan, every seat was a potential time bomb. She had to walk a tightrope, holding her balance as emotional tempests threatened to erupt at any moment. 2 hours after takeoff, once the plane had stabilized again, Morgan returned to the cabin to fix a malfunctioning reading light at seat 17A. The man seated there stood as requested, and she began inspecting the switch. At that moment, she noticed Jalen's backpack had slightly slipped into the aisle. "Is that your bag?" Her tone was clipped, laced with barely suppressed tension. Jalen looked up from his journal. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I'll push it in." He used his foot to gently nudge the backpack farther under the seat in front of him. "According to federal regulations, you're required to store it properly. It's not my job to keep repeating myself." Morgan's voice trembled, a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. Jalen froze. Since boarding, he hadn't blocked the aisle. He knew the rules well. The nearby passengers began to take notice, especially the elderly couple next to him. They exchanged uneasy glances. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize there was a problem. I'll be more careful." Jalen's tone remained composed, though a storm was beginning to brew inside him. Morgan stood still for a few seconds, as if wrestling with herself. Her eyes flashed with an unexplainable anger, something that didn't belong to Jalen but was crashing down on him like thunder. Then she swallowed her fury and returned to the broken light. No one spoke, but the row sank into a suffocating silence. Jalen glanced around and saw sympathy in the elderly couple's eyes, confusion in the furrowed brow of the passenger behind. He lowered his head and resumed writing, trying to bury his discomfort in every word he penned for Zuri. He had no idea that the real explosion was yet to come. Time dripped by. Morgan became increasingly rattled by the constant dinging of call buttons overhead. In the tiny galley at the back, a colleague spilled hot coffee on her hand, her yelp of pain echoing through the cabin. Everything seemed to be collapsing around Morgan. Meanwhile, Jalen remained hunched over his journal, unaware of the chaos unfolding around him. He wrote about his comrades' jokes, bizarre stories from desert night shifts. He imagined Zuri reading them on her next birthday. Each line was an anchor, each memory a reminder of why he was still alive and homeward bound. Suddenly, the seatbelt sign came on again. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "We're entering an area of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, secure the cabin." Just ahead of Jalen, in row 16, a passenger startled and dropped her handbag. A water bottle rolled backward, hitting Jalen's foot. The woman, ignoring the warning, bent over to gather her things. Morgan, rushing down the aisle to check the overhead bins, saw the scene and immediately intervened. "Ma'am, please sit down now. It's not safe." She raised her voice to be heard over the roar of the engines. The woman started to explain, but Morgan cut her off sharply. "I said, sit down, Jalen." Seeing the woman flustered, bent down and politely picked up the bottle. "Here you go." A simple, friendly gesture. But to Morgan, already brimming with pressure, it was the final drop. The water bottle rolled backward across the floor and lightly tapped Jalen Cross's foot. He bent down to pick it up, just as the man who had dropped it was crouched over, gathering his belongings, ignoring the glowing seatbelt sign, which now served as a stern warning. Morgan Wells rushed over, hurriedly closing the overhead compartments as the plane began to jolt slightly. "Sir, please sit down. It's not safe right now." Her voice had to rise above the roar of the engines. "I just dropped a few things," the man stammered. "Sit down. Now," she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. Seeing the man flustered, Jalen gently bent down and handed the bottle back. "Here you go," he said softly. A simple, courteous gesture. But in that moment of extreme tension, Morgan completely misinterpreted it. She saw him leaning forward, and in that instant, her mind, overloaded with anxiety and pressure, transformed his help into a threat. Her instinct kicked in like a storm. "What are you doing? Sit still!" she shouted. Jalen frowned. "Ma'am, I said sit down." Morgan's voice cracked through the cabin like a whip through the air. Passengers turned their heads in unison. Breaths caught. Heart rates spiked. No one expected they had just witnessed the opening seconds of what would soon rock the nation's media. Time froze. The plane jolted sharply. Overhead, lights flickered. Morgan, her face pale from adrenaline and built-up fury, stared at Jalen, the young soldier who had no idea what had just happened. And then, without warning, her arm swung. A sharp, dry slap cracked through the air, slicing through the metal fuselage. Morgan's hand struck Jalen's cheek with force. The cabin went completely silent, as if the air had been sucked out. Jalen sat frozen, eyes wide open, hands suspended in midair. His cheek burned. His ears rang. He couldn't believe that the person who had just slapped him was a flight attendant, someone trained to protect passengers, not assault them. One question echoed in his mind. Why then the outrage erupted? "What the hell are you doing?" A passenger shouted. "You can't do that." Another yelled angrily. The elderly couple next to Jalen looked at her as if they'd just witnessed a crime. A young man across the aisle fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he hit the record button. Morgan stepped back, gasping, her hands trembling as though electrified. Her eyes shifted from rage to shock, then to fear. She looked around as if searching for justification, but every pair of eyes was now locked on her as if she was the culprit. Jalen hadn't moved. His hand still hovered. His gaze was dazed. A young Marine behind him, also returning home, leapt to his feet, ignoring the seatbelt sign. "That's assault," he said through clenched teeth, his eyes blazing. The cabin descended into chaos. Children screamed. Adults murmured. Irene Salas, Morgan's colleague, came rushing over, her eyes wide with disbelief. Morgan opened her mouth, as if to say something, an apology, an explanation, but no words came out. And then, cornered by her own actions, she did something that made it all irreversible. She picked up the intercom phone, her hand still shaking. "Captain, we have a seriously disruptive passenger, requesting security assistance immediately. Prepare for emergency landing if necessary." The moment that sentence echoed over the cabin's PA system, the atmosphere transformed completely. Flight 274, once bound straight for Sierra Bay, was now veering toward a very different future. A calm voice spoke from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have a situation in the cabin that requires immediate attention. The aircraft will be diverted to Northgate Regional Airport. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." Panic spread like wildfire. What's going on? Is it a terrorist? Is someone hurt? Whispers and questions rippled across the rows. In just a few seconds, Morgan had not only slapped a soldier, she had thrown the entire flight into the eye of a public firestorm. Despite being slapped and labeled a disruptive passenger, Jalen Cross didn't react impulsively. He remained seated, breathing deeply, just as he had been trained to do to stay calm in a crisis. Part of him knew if there were an investigation, the most important thing was to ensure he hadn't contributed to the chaos. The plane began descending earlier than expected. The air inside the cabin thickened like a spring compressed for too long. Irene Salas approached Jalen, her hands trembling slightly, her voice as soft as a breeze. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. This was completely wrong." Her eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, where Morgan Wells stood with her arms crossed, her face pale as wax. No one could tell whether she felt remorse or was simply terrified of the consequences about to unfold. Behind Jalen, a group of passengers began whispering louder and louder. They spoke to Irene, to each other, to anyone who would listen. They had clearly seen Morgan slap him first. A soldier in uniform, merely picking up a dropped bottle, and in return, he was met with a violent slap. The Marine sitting directly behind Jalen clenched his teeth and muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable. An airline employee laying hands on a uniformed soldier." Others were worried about connecting flights, cancellations, and disrupted travel plans. But clearly, the incident between Jalen and Morgan was the tidal wave roaring through the plane. Jalen said nothing. His eyes were fixed forward, focused on the oath he once read aloud when enlisting, to serve with honor. He knew that if he let his emotions take over, he would become exactly what Morgan had accused him of, a threat. The plane continued to descend, banking toward Northgate Regional Airport. Meanwhile, in the control room and on the ground, a flurry of radio communications erupted. The airlines and airport security systems classified a violent passenger as a high-level incident. When the aircraft touched down on the runway, the cabin was dead silent. Outside, the red and blue lights of security and police vehicles swept across the windows, reflecting off the fading afternoon light. Some passengers craned their necks to get a glimpse, trying to guess what awaited them. Morgan, though visibly shaken, still managed to speak into the PA system. "Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." But her voice was dry, almost broken. All eyes gradually turned to Jalen, some filled with sympathy, others with suspicion. He wished he could sink into his seat, disappear from those piercing stares. Finally, the airplane door opened. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped in, followed by a supervisor from AeroVantage Airlines. They moved quickly down the aisle. The atmosphere grew heavier. Morgan pointed straight at Jalen. "It's him." Her voice was icy. "Sir," one of the security officers began, "we've received a report of a disruptive passenger and an alleged assault on a flight attendant. Please step out of your seat." Jalen rose slowly, eyes fixed on them. "I never laid a hand on her. I'm the one who was struck." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the officers' faces. They turned to Morgan, who quickly nodded in affirmation, her lips tightly pressed as if holding back the truth. But the people around them could no longer remain silent. She hit him first. "He was just helping pick something up. You can't arrest him for something that isn't true." The cabin erupted. Passengers shouted in protest. The entire row roared with voices defending Jalen. The supervisor spoke up, tension in his voice. "We will need both the passenger and the flight attendant to disembark for investigation. All other passengers, please remain in your seats until further notice." Jalen gave a silent nod. His heart pounded like a war drum. A journey that was supposed to lead to a reunion had turned into a trial in the sky. He stepped out of his seat, followed by Morgan, her head bowed low. Outside, the wind blew hard. The engines of nearby planes echoed across the tarmac. They were escorted into a small private room near the gate used specifically for handling isolated or incident-related passengers. Inside, two representatives from AeroVantage Airlines were already seated, faces stern, holding folders. A uniformed airport police officer was present as well, notebook in hand, his expression calm but unreadable. Jalen sat at one side of a low table. Morgan sat opposite. The distance between them felt like a bottomless chasm, not just in space, but in trust. She sat stiffly, her uniform still neat, but her expression hollow. Jalen noticed her hands trembling slightly, even as she tried to suppress it. One of the airline representatives spoke, voice firm and clear. I'm Trevor Langston, head of security relations at AeroVantage Airlines. We need to clarify several aspects of the incident that just occurred. We've received multiple conflicting reports about the incident on Flight 274, said Trevor Langston, his voice cold and slightly suspicious. Ms. Wells states that you, Mr. Cross, exhibited aggressive behavior that made her feel threatened. Jalen Cross took a deep breath. His gaze was steady, as if he had once stared down sandstorms and stray bullets. Only now he was on solid ground in a pressure-filled room. That's not true, sir. I've served in the military for nearly 5 years. Nothing like this has ever happened before. He paused briefly, then added firmly, She assaulted me. There was no provocation on my part. Passengers can confirm that. Morgan Wells opened her mouth, her lips trembling slightly, but then hesitated. The image of her hand slapping the young soldier's face was still vivid, searing in her mind. She glanced at Trevor Langston, her eyes pleading for something to hold on to. He reached toward me while I was dealing with another passenger. I didn't mean to hit him, but... So you did hit him, Trevor interjected, eyebrows raised. Morgan stammered. Finally, she whispered, It was an accident. On the table sat a neatly stacked pile of passenger statements. Some had written full paragraphs, others only a few lines with a phone number ready to testify. The airport police officer placed his hand on the stack, tapping the top sheet lightly. There are numerous witnesses contradicting your account. Ms. Wells. They confirm that you initiated the altercation. Morgan flushed red. She tried to keep her posture upright, but her eyes darted away, as if she were about to collapse. I thought he was interfering with my duties. I've been under a lot of stress lately. Jalen remained still, his voice calm, and even I never touched her. I was just picking up a water bottle and handing it back to another passenger. That's all. A heavy silence fell over the room, thick as a blackout curtain. No one said a word, but everyone understood the scales of truth were beginning to tip clearly in one direction. What no one in the room knew was that outside, the aftershocks of that slap were already spreading beyond the aircraft cabin. Back in the passenger cabin, the Marine who had spoken out in Jalen's defense was Corporal Andre Whitman, a veteran of numerous operations who would not tolerate injustice aimed at a fellow soldier. When he saw security escorting Jalen and Morgan off the plane, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Ignoring a warning glance from Irene Salas, he stood up. I need to speak with someone in charge. I witnessed the entire incident. The flight supervisor, visibly tense, nodded and motioned for him to follow. They passed through the jet bridge to a temporary holding area set up for delayed passengers. The space buzzed with complaint calls, crying children, and airport staff attempting to calm everyone down. Andre Whitman wasted no time. I served with PFC Cross. He's not the kind of man who causes trouble. Throughout the flight, he was respectful and well-behaved. That flight attendant attacked him, not the other way around. The supervisor nodded and led him to a quieter corner. We're collecting statements now. Thank you for coming forward. Andre pulled out his phone and showed a video he had recorded right after the slap. Though slightly shaky, the footage clearly showed Jalen reaching to pick up the dropped item, his hands raised to avoid misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Morgan was in an aggressive posture, her face contorted with anger as she closed in on him. The passengers' shouts were loud and clear on the recording. Don't hurt him. He didn't do anything wrong. The supervisor watched the screen, his expression growing more serious by the second. This is crucial evidence, he muttered, then immediately called Trevor Langston in the interview room to report the new development. Meanwhile, a wave of outrage was spreading among the passengers who had already deplaned. Rumors circulated quickly. A flight attendant had slapped a Black U.S. soldier, then blamed him, forcing an emergency landing. Some passengers were angry about delays and missed connections, but the majority were now talking about justice. This needs to be in the news. I'm posting this on social media. Within minutes, the story began spreading on Twitter, Facebook, and passenger forums. A scandal was forming fast, fierce, and uncontrollable. Inside the cramped interview room, the air felt suffocating. Trevor Langston had stepped out to take a phone call, leaving Jalen, Morgan, and the police officer in silence. Jalen sat quietly, hands clasped, his gaze discreetly observing the other side. It wasn't just a sense of betrayal in Morgan's eyes. He saw fatigue, confusion, and a deep, hopeless sorrow. The police officer broke the silence. "We'll wait for Mr. Langston to return before proceeding." He bent his head to continue writing. Morgan pressed her lips together, saying nothing. Time dragged on, as if the room had been cut off from the outside world, leaving only waiting and reckoning. Finally, Morgan Wells exhaled and spoke, as if summoning the last of her remaining courage. Her voice barely escaped her throat. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just lost control." Jalen Cross looked at her, his gaze no longer filled with anger, but with disciplined restraint. Part of him wanted to be furious, to shout that she had betrayed the sacred duty of a flight attendant. But instead, he asked why tears welled in Morgan's eyes, her lips pressed tightly, her voice choked. "I've been under so much pressure. My mother is in the hospital. I can't afford the medical bills. They warned me I'd be fired if there were any more complaints. I panicked. The passenger before you gave me a hard time, and when you leaned forward, I just thought you were a threat too." Jalen's voice softened, though it remained firm. "That doesn't justify hitting me." Morgan nodded, looking away. I know. Just then, Trevor Langston re-entered the room, his demeanor more resolute. "I've just received confirmation from other passengers. A video clearly shows that Mr. Cross was not the aggressor. Ms. Wells." Morgan stared down at the table, her complexion growing paler by the second. Langston continued, his tone steely. "We've also received several handwritten statements confirming your misconduct. This is a serious matter, potentially leading to criminal charges for assault. I hope you understand the gravity of this." Morgan closed her eyes. Her shoulders collapsed as if the strength had drained from her body. Jalen remained composed, but inside, a wave of emotion surged. The soldier in him could empathize with her stress, but the man in him felt betrayed. He couldn't help but wonder if he weren't a black man. Would things have been different? Langston turned to the officer. "We need to determine the next steps for Ms. Wells." Then to Jalen. "As for you, Mr. Cross, on behalf of AeroVantage Airlines, I offer our sincerest apologies." This was unacceptable. A faint, numb sense of relief crept through Jalen, but he knew this was only the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. Within hours, social media exploded. Platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram were flooded with short clips of the incident. The hashtag #YourSlappedSoldier quickly trended. A flight attendant slapping a U.S. soldier in the middle of a flight, an image no one thought could be real. Support for Jalen Cross poured in from every corner: veterans, people of color, frequent flyers, even political figures. Local news stations at Northgate Regional Airport immediately dispatched reporters to the scene. Passengers from Flight 274 were ready to speak up. They described the sound of the slap, the stunned look on Jalen's face, and the way Morgan had frantically called the captain as if he were a terrorist. Meanwhile, Jalen was swarmed with interview requests. Standing in a quiet hallway near a new boarding gate, a supervisor tried to help him rebook his flight to Sierra Bay, but at every exit, reporters waited, Cameras switched on. Microphones were thrust toward him, questions fired from every direction. For someone who had seen war zones, the pressure of the media felt more suffocating than gunfire. To make things worse, AeroVantage Airlines' initial public statement was a vague paragraph emphasizing an ongoing investigation and promising transparent procedures. The internet wasn't satisfied. People demanded Morgan Wells be fired immediately, that the airline compensate Jalen, and that a public press conference be held. As for Morgan, she was escorted from the terminal by airport police. Though not yet charged, the investigation was now officially underway. In a rare quiet moment in the hospital hallway, she called into her mother's room, still undergoing long-term treatment. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Mom, I just ruined my life." She no longer had a job. Her income was cut off, her reputation crushed. Public outrage was drowning her in a storm of online fury. And, most importantly, she knew she was in the wrong. Jalen sat in a private waiting room arranged by AeroVantage. Hours had passed since the slap, but the shock remained. All he wanted was to hug his sister Zuri, sit around the table with his mother, and leave this nightmare behind. But fate had placed him in a position no one asks for a symbol. The truth sometimes chooses the quietest people to speak on behalf of justice. He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant, fully aware the real battle had only just begun. After completing his statement with the police at Northgate, Jalen Cross was offered a hotel stay by a representative from AeroVantage Airlines, should he want time to consider legal action. But he only nodded silently and pulled out his phone. On the other end, his mother answered. After just one ring, "Jalen, are you at Northgate? What happened? Are you okay?" That question flung open the floodgates of emotions he'd been bottling up all day. His voice trembled as he recounted everything: the slap, the humiliation, the stares from the passengers, and the feeling of being trampled on in the middle of that cabin. He could feel his mother's heart tightening on the other end of the line, anger, worry, and a silent pride woven into one. As he spoke, the airline representative waited nearby. When Jalen hung up, the man stepped forward. "We're very sorry for what happened. This is what we can offer: a first-class ticket to Sierra Bay, immediate compensation, and full legal support should you choose to pursue a lawsuit." Jalen shook his head slightly, his brow furrowed. "I just want to go home. But this isn't something I can just pretend never happened. We understand, Mr. Cross, Ms. Morgan Wells has been suspended without pay, and an investigation is underway. We will fully cooperate with law enforcement, and the decision is yours." He replied simply, "I'll speak with my family and my commanding officer, then decide." Not long after, a local investigator arrived to take an official statement. Jalen recounted every detail, from the moment the bottle rolled to his feet, to the unjust slap, and the feeling of being dragged to the bottom by one irrational act. By the time the interview ended, the sun had dipped behind the skyline. He left Northgate on another flight, this one quiet. No shouting, no accusing eyes. But inside him, a quiet chaos still churned. When Jalen Cross stepped off the plane at Sierra Bay, just past midnight, his old backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes still carried the weight of exhaustion. Waiting at the arrivals gate were his mother and his sister, Zuri, now a tall teenager, eyes brimming with tears. She ran to him and wrapped her arms around him. "I missed you so much, Jalen." He bent down and held her tight, inhaling the familiar scent of home. Never had the words coming home carried so many layers of meaning. His mother stepped forward and hugged him tightly, whispering into his ear, "I know. The whole country's talking about it. I'm proud of you." Jalen exhaled deeply, his voice low. "I just wanted to come home in peace. But this, it's gone far beyond me." On the way home, in the old family car, a small sign reading, "Welcome home." Jalen lay neatly on the dashboard. Normally, he would have smiled brightly. But tonight, he simply stared out the window, watching the streetlights slide past the glass. He told his mother and Zuri everything. Though he tried to keep his tone neutral, Zuri cried quietly in the back seat. When they entered the small, familiar home, the framed photos of him in uniform still adorned the living room wall. His mother had made a late dinner, but no one felt like eating. They just sat around the table, quietly tasting the heaviness that lingered in every word and silence. His mother urged him to get checked if he had any headaches or neck pain. Zuri, impatient, asked, "Are you going to sue them?" Jalen didn't answer right away. His eyes rested on a half-eaten slice of apple pie. "I need time to think. Maybe. This isn't over yet." That night, Jalen didn't sleep deeply, but he found a bit of peace in the sound of the wind brushing past the windows, the city breathing in the night, and the simple fact that his family was close by. At the same time, Morgan Wells returned to her small apartment in Queens, New York. Her phone was flooded with messages, missed calls from HR, media, press. Everyone wanted her response, and she had nothing to say. She locked herself in her room, turned off her phone, and couldn't bring herself to look at the internet. The fury of social media had engulfed her name. She had become a symbol of prejudice, of a loss of control, of everything people condemned. A few days later, she received an official letter from AeroVantage Airlines, Ms. Wells, due to serious violations of safety regulations and unprofessional conduct, we are hereby terminating your employment effective immediately. The words were cold, final. The reason was clearly stated: endangering a passenger, violating company procedures, and causing significant damage to the airline's image. Morgan sat still, her heart clenched. Everything was gone, and this was only the beginning of the unraveling to come. The letter from AeroVantage Airlines was printed in a language so cold it sent chills down her spine. The bolded header stated the company's zero-tolerance policy on assault and unprofessional behavior. Morgan Wells's hands trembled as she reached the line that confirmed her termination. Her heart pounded as if it were trying to burst through her chest. Before she could catch her breath, a call came from a Northgate investigator. His voice was calm, but left no room for negotiation. "If Jalen Cross decides to pursue the matter, we will proceed with criminal charges." Morgan nearly collapsed. She broke down, trying to explain her circumstances. Her mother, Cynthia Wells, was battling end-stage kidney disease. The medical bills were overwhelming, and now she had no insurance to cover them. I can't afford a lawyer. Please, have mercy on me." But the investigator only repeated one thing: the legal process will be followed to the letter, at the hospital. Morgan forced on a calm face as she stepped into her mother's room. Cynthia lay there, frail and unconscious, surrounded by tubes and the soft humming of a dialysis machine. When she woke, she gently held her daughter's hand and whispered, "Everyone makes mistakes, but you have to try to make it right." Morgan. Her mother's words cut like a blade. Morgan didn't even know where to begin. She had lost her job, her income to support her mother, and her reputation had fallen off a cliff. Those who once admired her neighbors, old friends, distant relatives, now avoided her like even speaking with her could stain their own name. Bills piled up. Debt collection calls came daily. Each ring was a panic trigger, more than once in the dead of night. She wanted to call Jalen, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but she knew she had no right to ask for that. To the public eye, she had become the embodiment of prejudice and cruelty. Everything society demanded be rooted out. Meanwhile, in Sierra Bay, Jalen Cross was wrestling with a different internal battle. Friends, fellow soldiers, Strangers online all urged him to stand up for justice, but he felt suffocated by the idea of litigation. He hadn't joined the military to sue people. He'd joined to serve, to protect, not to become the center of a legal firestorm. He reached out to someone he trusted, Captain Lana Whitford, the legal officer in his unit. At a small diner where they had met many times before for paperwork discussions, Jalen shared every detail from the slap to the lie, and even Morgan's shaken expression afterward. Whitford took notes quickly, then looked at him with a firm expression. "You have every right to file a civil suit against AeroVantage. As for the criminal case, that's up to the state. But your testimony is critical." She paused, her gaze piercing. "But more importantly, how do you feel?" Jalen stared into the swirl of cream dissolving in his coffee. "I don't want to ruin someone's life. I'm angry, yes, but she might just be a woman on the edge. I don't know if it was racism or just panic. I think about her sick mother, and I feel pity." Whitford placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Jalen, but don't forget she hit you, and she called in a security alert to blame you. This isn't minor." He nodded, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. The image of the slap still burned on his cheek, not just physically, but with the humiliation it carried. After many days of reflection, Jalen made his decision. He would fully cooperate with the criminal investigation and was prepared to testify, if necessary. But he would not file a civil lawsuit unless Morgan attempted to shift the blame onto him during court proceedings. He hoped, however fragile that hope, that out of this trial might come some measure of understanding and a lesson for everyone, including himself. A few weeks later, on a chilly morning in Sierra Bay, Jalen Cross walked into a nonprofit center called Newbridge Outreach, an organization focused on reconciliation and healing after conflict. A former unit buddy had recommended it to him, saying it was a place where those who had been hurt could find a way forward, even those who had caused the hurt. He wasn't sure why he was there, only that some part of him wanted to understand after everything. Could forgiveness still exist? Newbridge Outreach, a small center nestled in a quiet residential corner of Sierra Bay, specializes in conflict resolution and community restoration. An old unit friend had once recommended the place to Jalen Cross, praising its healing programs for veterans and civilians alike after trauma. When Jalen stepped inside, he expected nothing more than silence. But to his surprise, a staff member approached him immediately. "Are you Sergeant Cross? We've been expecting you." He frowned, surprised. "Expecting me? I didn't make an appointment." The woman smiled gently. "Morgan Wells reached out ahead of time. She's looking for a way to make amends if you're open to it." Jalen's heart stopped. Restorative justice, a foreign and uneasy term. It involved a face-to-face meeting between the person harmed and the one who caused the harm, guided by a trained facilitator. The goal: understanding, accountability, and, if possible, forgiveness. The thought of facing Morgan twisted his stomach. The memory of the slap, the stunned faces, and the whisper-disruptive passenger was still painfully fresh. But then, curiosity and a flicker of compassion led him to nod. The room where they met was lit with soft, ambient light. Inspirational quotes about healing and forgiveness hung on the walls. Morgan Wells stood by the window, hands clasped, posture guarded. She wore a pale blouse and black slacks, a far cry from the polished flight attendant she once was. The dark circles under her eyes marked the toll of many sleepless nights. As Jalen entered, their eyes met. Tears shimmered in the corners of hers. A mediator stepped forward, gently inviting them to sit across from each other, separated only by a small wooden table. Morgan spoke first, her voice trembling. "I'm not here to make excuses. I lost my job, and I may be facing prosecution. I accept that. But I need you to know, I never meant to hurt you or disrespect the uniform you wear." She paused, holding back a sob. I was just terrified. My mother is seriously ill. My job was on the line. I let all of that out the wrong way, in a terrible way. Jalen clenched his hands, a storm of emotion stirring inside him. He glanced at the mediator, who gave a slight nod, signaling that he could speak when ready. He nodded faintly. The fact that she was here, that at least was a step. The conversation went on. Morgan recounted months of mounting stress, overwhelming medical bills, the constant fear of being fired over one more complaint, and thoughtless passengers pushing her to the brink. She admitted she'd been living in a state of chronic anxiety, and on that day, when she saw Jalen lean forward amid the turbulence, her panicked instinct had taken over. Jalen listened silently. He nodded occasionally, but his eyes remained guarded, his feelings cautious. He remembered nights on desert patrol, the sound of explosions, cold sweat down his back, and the times he had to stay calm to protect innocent civilians. Pressure. He understood, but he had never let it justify hitting anyone. When Morgan finished, her shoulders shook softly with emotion. The mediator turned to Jalen. "Would you like to share something?" He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the tabletop between them. "I won't lie. I'm still hurt. You humiliated me in front of a full cabin. You labeled me dangerous, that could have destroyed my military career." His voice caught for a moment, but his eyes stayed steady. "But I also see you're human. You made a mistake. You've lost almost everything. I believe in accountability, but I also believe in second chances if someone truly wants to make it right." Morgan exhaled, nearly collapsing into her seat, her eyes glistening. "I'm willing to do anything to prove that. Volunteer, issue a public apology, support veterans organizations, anything." Jalen tightened his jaw. His voice was low but resolute. "Words aren't enough. But if you're truly willing to change, to treat everyone with respect, no matter their skin color or background, then maybe this can be a beginning." A single tear slid down Morgan's cheek. "Thank you." Morning light streamed into the room, casting a glow across two faces that had once stood in confrontation. In that moment, the bitterness buried deep within the wound seemed to step back, not gone, but far enough to make space for something else: understanding, and maybe, one day, forgiveness. Whether that understanding would survive public opinion, legal proceedings, and media scrutiny was still unknown. But today, at least, they had chosen not to remain adversaries. A few weeks after the restorative session, the Northgate District Attorney's Office officially announced it would charge Morgan Wells with misdemeanor assault based on video evidence and multiple passenger testimonies. Unable to afford private counsel, Morgan was assigned a public defender. She prepared to plead guilty. She knew full well that if brought to trial and convicted, the penalty would likely be harsher. Meanwhile, Jalen Cross, now back at his military base, received a formal request for cooperation in the investigation. He could testify in person or via secure remote connection. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to stand before the court and tell the whole story, but another part feared that the pain would be stirred up all over again. He called his mother. Her voice was warm but firm. "Don't let anger or pity guide you. Do what you believe is right." In the end, he chose to testify remotely. That morning, he wore his full uniform and sat in a small conference room on base, the fluorescent lights casting a faint glow on the medals on his chest. On the screen, Morgan appeared pale, seated beside her public defender, avoiding Jalen's gaze. In court, he recounted everything in detail, from the moment the turbulence began, to the dropped bottle, to the instant he bent down to pick it up and was slapped. The prosecutor pressed the point, focusing on Morgan's overreaction and disruptive conduct. The defense attempted to highlight possible misunderstanding or momentary panic. Jalen didn't waver. He spoke calmly and precisely without condemnation, but without minimizing the truth. After his testimony, Morgan's attorney proposed a plea deal. Given that she had no prior record and had expressed sincere remorse, they requested a lenient sentence, community service, an anger management course, and a formal public apology. The judge considered it, then nodded, sparing Morgan a jail sentence. But her tone was firm. "Ms. Wells, your actions were reprehensible. We are giving you this chance not out of leniency, but out of belief in rehabilitation." After the hearing, public opinion was divided. Some felt the punishment was too light. Others supported the outcome, seeing it as a balance between justice and compassion. For Jalen, it was enough. He had spoken the truth. He had fulfilled his duty. And the justice system, at least this time, had found the right line to walk. Yet, deep down, one question lingered. Had Morgan truly changed? And would this story leave a lesson for those standing at the edge between fear and compassion? Less than a week later, Jalen received an envelope from the legal office of Vantage Airlines. Inside was a formal letter of apology from Morgan Wells. The tone was measured. The handwriting felt as though it came from the bottom of a long fall. She admitted her mistake, the impulsive slap, the fabrication to deflect blame, and the consequences she had caused for Jalen, the other passengers, and the airline's reputation. She pledged to devote most of her community service hours to supporting veteran organizations, helping at job fairs, assisting at the VA hospital, and learning about the sacrifices made by service members. In a modest break room at the barracks, Jalen folded the letter. The ceiling fan hummed above. He sat still for a moment. Not relieved, not angry, just a sense of closure. Outside, Vantage Airlines also began to take responsibility. They announced a new internal review of training protocols, adding programs on stress management and unconscious bias for all flight crew. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was at least a beginning. As for Jalen, he became an unwilling symbol. Reporters sought him out. Veterans organizations invited him to speak. Social media dubbed him the quiet hero. But he didn't care for the spotlight. He returned to his family, to his duties in the unit, in his free time. He played with his younger sister Tasha, who occasionally made him learn the latest TikTok dance. The slap that once shocked the nation gradually faded from the collective memory. New headlines swept it away. But for those who lived it, the lesson remained etched in time about the fragility of human interaction, the cost of bias and anger, and the fragile, fleeting chance to make amends. Time passed swiftly, like hurried flights streaking across the sky. Months turned into a year since the slap that shook America echoed inside the cabin of Flight 914. But for those who had lived through the storm, the memory remained etched like a mark carved into cold steel. Morgan Wells completed the court-mandated anger management course. Now, she worked part-time at the front desk of a small clinic near a nursing center where her mother continued battling chronic kidney disease. It was modest work with little pay, but it allowed her to stay close to her mother and kept her mind from sinking into darker thoughts. On weekends, she quietly volunteered at a veterans center in Sierra Bay. Though some still recognized her from the infamous video, she didn't hide. She chose to face it not to justify, but to prove that a single mistake doesn't define an entire person. Once, an elderly man in a wheelchair. A veteran looked at her calmly and said, "You can't change the past, but you can decide your future." That sentence became Morgan's compass. Each day, she tried to live better, think before reacting, and let compassion take precedence over fear. She had lost everything: her career, her reputation, nearly her freedom. But in return, she found something she had never taken time to consider before: inner growth. Jalen Cross, on the other hand, gradually regained his footing. The incident no longer haunted him like it once had. Anger and confusion gave way to a quiet calm, partly because justice had been served, partly because he chose to forgive, though never forget. He was promoted and entrusted with mentoring younger soldiers at Redfield Base. In his sessions, he occasionally shared the story of the slap, not as a complaint, but as a living lesson in emotional control, dignity, and choosing how to respond when caught in the eye of a storm, sometimes in the quiet of the night. He thought back to that final meeting with Morgan at Newbridge Outreach, though they never spoke again. He silently hoped she was still on the path of making things right, not for his sake, but to become better for herself. Both Jalen and Morgan had been through a violent upheaval. One was wronged and nearly falsely accused. The other let emotion override reason, leaving irreversible consequences. But both had learned a vital truth. Not every mistake has to be the end of a life if we have the courage to own it and the will to make amends. Their story was once the center of national debate. People took sides, judged, argued. But eventually, the media moved on. New headlines buried the old. Only those who lived it truly understood the weight of every action, every decision. For Morgan, the slap was once a period. Now, it had become a comma opening a new journey of humility, service, and renewal. For Jalen, it didn't turn him into a victim, but stood as proof of the soldier's character: calm, principled, and unyielding in the face of injustice. That story, the slap that shook a flight, had now become a sobering legend. One impulsive moment can break everything. But from that very moment, courage and empathy can plant the seeds of something good. Sometimes, it's in the greatest conflicts that we uncover the deepest truths about ourselves. The story ends, but the lesson remains. Sometimes it only takes a second to change someone's life. A gesture misunderstood, a word left unsaid, or in this case a slap heard across the nation. But what truly matters is what comes after. Jalen Cross walked through betrayal, humiliation, and the public spotlight, and still chose dignity over vengeance. Morgan Wells spiraled from panic into consequence and had to rebuild her life from the rubble of a single mistake. And yet, somewhere along that broken road, they both found something rare: clarity, humility, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of healing. Because this story isn't just about blame. It's about being human, about what happens when fear, stress, and prejudice collide at 30,000 feet. It's about the courage to speak up and the grace to listen. And it's about how even the most painful chapters can push us toward growth if we let them. As you reflect on what happened aboard Flight 914, ask yourself, what would you have done in Jalen's seat? How do we hold people accountable without erasing their humanity? And how do we turn outrage into understanding without losing our sense of justice? This isn't just a story we watched. It's one we all live in: airports, classrooms, offices, and conversations every day. If this journey moved you, if it made you feel something, or see the world just a little differently, don't let it end here. Like this video and let us know which moment stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that second chances are possible. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that don't just inform, they transform. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs stories that matter and people like you who care enough to pass them on. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.